When I say James and habit in the same sentence, if you've done any self-improvement research at all, you're going to think of James Clear, right? And for good reason. James has done a lot of really great work in the art of habit, but there's another James that is probably not on your radar. And that's quite a shame because he's got a very profound insight into habits. And so in this episode, we're going to be discussing the maxims on habit straight from the mind of the father of American psychology, William James. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode. My name's Devan. Thanks so much for joining me. As you know, in today's episode, we're going to be diving into habit. And so if you want to follow along on the journey that I am trying to go on here, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you like this video and if you think I do a good job and I've been improving, hit the like button. That just let me know that I'm doing a good job. Habits, when we talk about habits, what are they? Why do we form them? It's really clear to me that we need to understand what we are, right? And so when we think about what we are, I like to go to the classical sense of the human person. And that one seems to be the most broad and the most encapsulating view of what we are. And so the classical sense of the human person, as I've covered before, is we'll start at the bottom here. We have our senses, right? Our baseline sensorial organs, right? Our five senses, we could say. We could sum it up into that. And then above that, we have feeling. That's your emotions. That's, kind of those visceral reactions that we might have, right? That really bodily, right? Those are going to be our feelings. But, they can be a little cognitive too. But for the base sense, we'll stick with that's our feeling. And then when we go beyond that, when we go to what's above that, those are our baser senses. Beyond that is our will. In the classical sense of the human person, we have the will. And as I'll explain a little further down the way, the will is essentially that force which actualizes what our next step up is, which is our intellect. What our intellect perceives as significant, our will actualizes that potential. It moves the potential energy into kinetic energy. I think it's been a while since I've taken physics, but I think I have a baseline understanding of that. But that's basically all it is. And so when we think about habits are training, right? Habits go from top to bottom, right? Or sometimes they go from bottom to top. And so the ones that go from top to bottom, those are going to be intellectual habits we've decided, right? We've made a conscious effort in some way or another. We've found a problem and we're wanting to solve that by creating a habit, right? And so we want to become a better writer. And so what we do is we sit down at the keyboard, right? And we start typing. And then part of that, as we do that over time, we start to become better and better at it, which is great because what happens when you have a habit and you start to master that is that you free up your conscious space, you free up the load, that cognitive load on your brain, you free that up so it can focus more on the higher order processes. We're no longer trying to discern what the feeling of the keyboard is, right? We're not trying to remember each letter, although I admit I sometimes have to look because I get lost. But for the most part, at this point, I can type without looking because I've memorized. It's become a habit and ingrained. And so my writing becomes much more clear to me. It's much more connected between the idea and what I produce, because that's the gap in habit that we're trying to fill. We're trying to fulfill a need, and we're not always good at doing that, right? And so I think of when I was on the track and field team and all the other sports that I've done too, as I progressed in my proficiency at those things, it became much more clear to me what I was doing wrong, and the ability for me to fix that improved exponentially. And so as I got better as time went on and I continued to do things, my change happened not linearly, but exponentially. And so that's the amazing thing about habits is we're bringing our minds and bodies together within a given context in order to become more efficient, right? And that's important. And so we could use the example, of sports. We could use the example of brushing your teeth. We're gonna try and bring this out. And so James Clear wrote Atomic Habits. I don't think that I have to go over that too much because there's 1,000,005 videos, I'm sure, on James Clear in one way or another talking about the Atomic Habits. And so I'm going to link below a video that I thought was pretty helpful, and actually a little video that we're going to look at it. But in order to not be redundant about Atomic Habits, I think I'm just going to cover at a baseline, 4 quick points and a couple good quotes. But before that, if you're watching this video because you want to improve your life, if you want to make your life better and live maximally, you're going to want to follow my weekly newsletter and join along the journey, right, of my newsletter, Reaching More. Reaching More is just what the title implies. How to reach more every day in your life, whether it's relationships, whether it's personal habits, right? Whether it's spirituality, whatever that might be, right? We're always trying to reach for more. At least we should be, because we're either marching towards flourishing or we're falling down to destruction, right? And so how can we flourish as best as we can with our given abilities? And so every Thursday comes in your mailbox. It's totally free. Another bonus for signing up for my newsletter is that you will receive my reading list. If you ever wondered what books have been, most influential to our development, math, science, philosophy, politics, history, then this is definitely the place to start. Now, certainly it's not a perfect guide. It's not a comprehensive guide, but it's some of the most significant contributions made throughout the last 3,500 years. And you get all of that greatness for free, totally free when you sign up. And so sign up or don't, that's okay. But I'd love to have you along in the conversation. So when we look at habits, when we talk about, the things we form, it's easy to fall into the trap of productivity culture that exists so much today. We have so many systems. And in fact, James says that you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And so we try so hard to implement so many systems for productivity, for efficiency, for time management, right? We try so many different things. And what ends up happening is that we actually overburden ourselves with new systems that we don't actually let the other systems become ingrained in us for them to work. And so we could have a dozen systems that would work if we'd give it time, but because we haven't let time persist, right, and us to reap the benefits of our investments quite yet, we skip over that, and then we get stuck in this trap of procrastinating productively, right? We're productively procrastinating, and we're trying to implement all of these systems, all these productivity models, all this time efficiency in order to be productive, but we're not actually letting the thing happen, because in our culture today, we have new things in front of us every second, and it's so interesting, it's so ingraining, right? You might have come across this video and thought that what I was talking about was interesting, whatever part that might be. And so you're like, oh, I got to have this. And then at the moment that I start to become disinteresting and I start to drone on like I sometimes do, you just become disinterested, and we don't let time persist, right? And so what we need to do is find a way to stop the hacking of our time, right? We need to hack our productivity by allowing time to work, and we just don't like to do that. And so I think while James's habits are great, which I'll get into just a couple of the insights here in a moment, but I think that we need more, right? And so James Clear developed this system that it's incredibly motivating. It's an incredibly comprehensive system, right? It's backed by tons of research, and he mentions examples all the time. And I think it's really helpful for people, but it just misses something. And so when we talk about will, especially, James kind of dismisses that, and you'll see that here in a moment. And so, again, in light of all the copious amounts of videos on James and atomic habits, I'm just going to cover, for the sake of this video, 4 principles that I think kind of are able to be drawn out of that, but don't quite meet the mark, right? And so something that we can still improve on. It's not a bash by any means of James's system. I think it's incredible. It's helped me quite a bit, but I think there's more. I think that there's a greater there's something greater in us, and it comes down to recognizing who we are and this fundamental capacity within us that so often modern science, modern psychology seems to ignore. And so in James's framework, there is, number one, I think, is that if you want better results, forget about setting goals. You need to focus on your systems, right? Focus on the systems, because you fall to the level of your systems. You don't rise to the height of your goals, right? You don't reach that greatness. You always, when there's stress, you always revert back to what's habitual. What are my core habits? Number 2, the 4 laws of behavior change are just a very simple set of rules that we can use to build better habits. And so they're make it obvious, number 1. Number 2, make it attractive. Number 3, make it easy. And number 4, make it satisfying. And so this is baseline behaviorist thinking. It's just a little bit more nuanced, right? And so it's brought a little bit more modern from Skinner's original framework, right? Or whoever you might want to say this is based off, but it's all the same, essentially, right? It's all in the mind of that your behaviors change who you are, right? That we're molded by that. And so when we're thinking about making it obvious, you're taking steps to put the thing right in front of you, right? To set up your environment in a way that is conducive to flourishing, right? To flourishing of this habit. And then you got to make it attractive. It can't, if it's going to suck, it's not going to happen, right? So you got to make it attractive. You got to make it, something has to be good about it, right? And so number 3 is got to make it easy. It can be hard to do this because, right, in our modern psychology brain, we don't have willpower, right? That's not enough anymore. We need systems, right? We need to rely on these systems, and which fundamentally I disagree with. That's a point of disagreement that I'll just say. And number 4 is to make it satisfying. We have to have a hit of dopamine at some point, which I agree with, right? We have to have a bit of reward for that, but I don't know if it necessarily comes in the way that we want it to, but that's all right. And then number 3, takeaway from James is that nested within each of those is the layers of behavior change. And so you have the outcomes, and this is a quote, outcomes are about what you get, processes are about what you do, and identity is about what you believe. And then you kind of flip that if you want the order of importance, right? And so the identity is what you believe, and from that you get the process and the outcomes, right? Now you need a plan. You need to have a intelligent identity, right? It can't be a incoherent identity, because that just mixes you up and you don't get anywhere with a incoherent false identity. And so what you need to do is you need to set yourself up right with who you are, and then you need to go forward. And then number 4 is habit and deliberate practice equals mastery. Baseline formula, right, is just that when we do things over and over, when we have a system of success and we have deliberate practice, when we're being intentional about what we're doing, we become masters in that, right? We excel because that's what we do, right? We have that time. Practice, deliberate practice is time, and we're allowing that system to work. And so James has just created this great model for that, and I've found success when I've implemented it. But again, he misses a fundamental part, and I'm just going to play this clip so see if you can guess kind of what he misses. And even though I've already said it, just kind of see about which part and let me know if you picked it out.
They left the researcher's facility the next day. They weren't motivated. It's like reading a book or watching a YouTube or listening to a motivational speaker, and then you forget all about it 20 minutes later. But the third group, the group that had a specific plan for how they were going to implement the behavior, 9 out of 10 of them worked out. So you can increase your odds of success 2 to 3x just by having a specific plan. And this is the insight. Many people think that they lack motivation when what they really lack is clarity. They think that they need to get more motivated, that they need willpower in order to execute on a habit. If I just felt like writing, if I just felt like meditating, if I felt like working out, then I would do it. But in fact, they don't have a plan for it, and so they wake up each day thinking, I wonder if I'll feel motivated to write today. I wonder if I'll feel motivated to work out today. But instead, you can take the decision-making out of it by explicitly stating when, where, and how you want to implement the habit. So
James misses willpower, right? Or at least he dismisses it, and he just kind of throws it out. And now what I want to do is I kind of want to break that down just a little bit more and then get into the significant contributions that I think the other James, William James, makes, because I think it's much more comprehensive, and it's a model built on who we really are rather than the modern, empirical idea of what we are. And so when we think about willpower, what is willpower? Willpower is just the strength of the will. And that begs the question, what is the will? Well, like I said earlier, the will is that thing that brings the potential energy to the actual. It actualizes that. And, it's not feeling. Here's what it's not. It's not feeling. And it is not a motivation factor. That's part of it, right? That's part of the will, but the will is not something that comes from motivation, right? When we will something, and this is a strange concept to us moderns, right? The ancients understood it profoundly, right? They had a profound understanding of what the will was, but we've kind of lost that in our empiricism. And so what the will is, it's this faculty of our spirit, of our soul, that forces and guides us to action, right? And willpower is just the strength in which we do that despite circumstances against us, right? It's something that sits between the intellect and our feelings. And when, we look at what we are, it's that peace that brings about from the highest divine capacity is intellect, right? Because it's the thing that separates us the most from other animals than anything else, really, because otherwise we're just animals if we don't have these divine capacities. And so the will is another divine capacity, but instead of being, pure form, what it is, it starts to usher in this temporal action, right? There's something down in the world. And so our will actualizes our potential. It turns our potential energy into kinetic energy and gets us moving. Now, what we can say about the will is that not everybody is in agreement of what it is. And so in light of that, I'm going to give an example that William James brings in, just talking about the will and what the will is. And so he says, and he takes this from John Stuart Mill, no matter how full a reservoir of maxims one may possess, and no matter how good one's sentiment may be, if one has not taken advantage of every concrete opportunity to act, one's character may remain entirely unaffected for the better. With mere good intentions, hell is proverbially paved. And this is an obvious consequence of the principles we have laid down. A character, as John Stuart Mill says, is a completely fashioned will, and a will, in the sense in which he meant, is an aggregate of tendencies to act in a firm and prompt and definitive way upon all the principal emergencies of life. A tendency to act only becomes effectively ingrained in us in proportion to the uninterrupted frequency with which the actions actually occur, and the brain grows to their use. Every time a resolve or a fine glow of feeling evaporates without bearing practical fruit is worse than a chance lost. It works so as positively to hinder future resolutions and emotions from taking the normal path of discharge. There is no more contemptible type of human character than that of the nerveless sentimentalists and dreamers who spends his life in a weltering sea of sensibility and emotion and never does a manly concrete deed. And so That was like kind of a long quote, but the will is the thing that actualizes the potential despite the feeling, right? Because if you just sit in this, animalistic sensuality, right? If you're just always involved in your feelings, you're not going to do anything. And that's what happens to a lot of people is they sit and they mentally masturbate, to be a little provocative, to be a little harsh here. I mean, they do that when they sit and listen to all these motivational speakers and they don't do anything. And that's why in that clip, when James was talking about the people who listened to the motivational speakers still didn't have the actual outcome that they were hoping for. Now it was better than just the control group, but when we actually have a plan, and that's just the point, the will needs an education. Without education, the will doesn't know where to go, and that's where we run into trouble. And that's the issue that I think we have now, is that the education of the things of the higher divine capabilities is lacking. And we even just throw the will out completely, and even in the sense of free will, right? A lot of people imagine us as these biological mechanisms that just have this weird, mysterious capacity for rationality, just a coin that we've termed that makes us no better than animals, but just sets us apart a little differently. We're just a little bit more organized and somehow have this capacity for speech, right? We just throw it out and it doesn't make any sense because there is something more, and it just does what science does and reduces it to its core until it's just mush, right? Have you ever left a meal and reheated it so many times that it's just this mush? It's just this garbage that you can't even fathom to eat. That's exactly what's happened with the discussion on will and what we are. We've just mushed us down into just atoms and even worse than that. And so I think it's important that we recognize the importance of the will and the significance of that. And so, because when we say what we are, when we have this will, we have to recognize that we have free will. And so now I might get pushed back on that. That's great. That's awesome. I'd love to have that conversation. But we ultimately have the option, the necessity actually to choose. We don't get to choose. How do I say it? We don't get to choose we get to choose what the thing we choose, but we don't actually get to not choose. We don't get to choose whether we choose. And so we always have to make a choice. And so that's where people sometimes get into, well, we're actually deterministic. And I think there's strong cases for it, but I eventually think it falls flat in how you look at it. And so what we need to do is educate the will, because almost everything we do is habitual. Even not having a habit, a strict order of things is a habit. And so, and William James says this about habit: the great thing then in all education is to make the nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. It's to fund and capitalize our acquisitions and live at ease upon the investment of the fund. For this we must make automatic and habitual as early as possible, as many useful actions as we can, and guard against the growing into ways that are likely to be disadvantageous to us, as we should guard against the plague. The more of the details of our daily life we can hand over to the effortless custody of optimism, the more our higher powers of mind will be set free of their proper work. There's no more miserable human being than one in whom nothing is habitual but indecision, and for whom the lighting of every cigar, the drinking of every cup, the time of rising and going to bed every day, and the beginning of every bit of work are subjects of express volitional deliberation. Full half the time of such a man goes to deciding or regretting of such matters which ought to be so ingrained in him as practically not to exist for his consciousness at all. If there be such daily duties not yet ingrained in any one of my readers, let him begin this very hour to set the matter right. And so this is important that we take care of setting our habits right, that we do the right thing and set ourselves on a trajectory of flourishing. The true importance of this automatization comes from the need to educate our will. We need to educate it so that we know that where we're pointing to is a good end, right? Because we don't act in a way that we don't think serves some good. And so let's set up our habits so that we can have the highest good being pursued. And so in order to do that, we need to understand that our will is a conscious effort. As Carl Jung puts it, it is highly important for a young man who is still unadapted and has yet achieved nothing to shape the conscious ego as effectively as possible. That is, to educate the will. Unless he is positively a genius, he may not believe in anything active within himself that is not identical with his will. He must feel himself a man of will, and he must safely depreciate everything else within himself, or suppose it's subject to his will, for without the illusion he can scarcely bring about a social adaptation. So unless we acknowledge that it's a conscious effort for us to will something into being, for us to actualize that potential, that intellectual potential, or vice versa, that sensational potential that's in us, right? That will has to bring it about. We have to put it into motion. And so here's where we start to discuss what habits lead us to having this will be educated, and how we can set ourselves up and set our habits up properly. Here are the 4 maxims of William James, and I discuss these in this way because James has built up so far in his principles of psychology. He's built up to this point, and now he continues to go beyond that, but I've only read to this point, and it's captivated me very much so. And so next he talks about the automaton theory of human beings, and I think it'll be really interesting. I started just like the first 2 paragraphs, and so nothing major to report, but what he says here is so up to speed really with our culture of productivity, and goes beyond, and he continues to go beyond too, and he covers what we are, and he talks about our reflexes and how habits start to form because of our reflexes. Our reflexes have kind of educated us in a way or another, and guided us towards one decision over another, and that eventually we have to decide whether or not a habit, a string of reactions, is something necessary for us to keep doing in order to achieve an end that we've decided upon. And so I know that might be a little bit confusing. Hopefully the 4 maxims cleared up a little bit, because it's very, very deep, and it goes beyond what our productivity culture does today, even someone as clear as James Clear. And so number 1 is that we must take care to launch ourselves with as strong and decided initiative as possible. So we have to have a plan. That's what's been stated in our culture today. We have to have a plan. Nothing matters more than a plan. And so part of a plan is goal setting, right? We have to know what we're aiming towards. But aside from that, we have to know how we're going to get there. It's almost more important to know how we're going to get there and take charge in being very intentional in deciding what we're going to do, rather than setting the goals, right? Because we could goal set all day and just not get anywhere. And so it's important that we launch ourselves with as strong and decided initiative as possible, so that when we have this plan, when we're confronted with an obstacle, we just continue, because we have a plan. It's a design that we're going to just continue to carry out. And so, number 1, take care to launch ourselves with as strong and decided initiative as possible. Number 2, never suffer an exception to occur till the new habit is securely rooted in your life. we live in a world of exceptions. We see exceptions all the time on social media. We see ourselves giving way to exceptions. Just this one time. Oh, I'll just have a cheat meal. The idea of a cheat meal is ingrained in the beginner health nut. And so we try to hold on to these exceptions. Oh, just this once. I can just slip up just this once. And James says no. William James says that is absolutely not the case. Never suffer an exception to occur till the habit is securely rooted in your life. Because, and he illustrates this by winding up a ball of yarn and you allow it to slip. You've allowed in one moment a whole lot longer of an effort, of time spent doing something. You've let that just go away. And now it's not to say that you haven't rolled up a tremendously more amount of yarn, right, in your ball of experience, of habitual planning and trying to ingrain your neural networks in a certain way, but you've let it slip. You've proved that there's an alternate way that you can go, and that when things get a little too hard, or there's just this right collection of circumstances, that you can let it go. And so we can't do that. Not until it's securely established as the way, as it's the system in which we operate. Again, going back to James Clear, that's very much what he says. It's very much in line. And I think that James's systems meet the first two maxims that William James sets forward. But I think that there is 3 and 4, and these are the ones that William James had devised on his own as a result of these first two from someone else. These next two, I think, are most important, especially the last one, in how to keep our goals and our habits in motion. And so number 3 is to seize the very first opportunity to act on every resolution you make and on every emotional prompting you may experience in the direction of the habits you aspire to gain. It's very important that what we're doing is acting every single time. Yesterday, I had finally gotten home after eating lunch with a friend and then doing some shopping. I found some great books. You might have saw them on Instagram or Twitter. But I found some books, got home, and in the corner of my garage is a gun cabinet that I purchased, honestly, probably 7 years ago at this point. And I had torn apart. I started sanding, and because I wanted to refinish it, and I just never finished it. And yesterday, I just had this pull. I had a bit of free time, and I said, why don't I do this? Why don't I start this? And so I had this pull. I had this initial motivation, and which motivation is good, right? We don't want to shy away from motivation, but I had this motivation. I said, let's act on it. Now, I'm kind of impulsive anyway, but I said, how can I set up a plan for myself to actually finish this? And so I devised a quick little way. Then I'm just going to leave it in the middle of my garage until I finish it. And it's worked, because I hate not being able to pull my car into my garage fully, and I have to park outside my garage, and I don't like that. I just enjoy parking in my garage. I have it. Why not? And I also decided that it's nice to have that space. I haven't had that corner in my garage since I moved in, because I just set it right there. I just kind of carried this thing along over the years of moving, and finally I decided that I'm just going to go for it. And so I had an emotional prompting, and that was a goal that I had. And now this isn't quite a habit, but it's still just, we need to take advantage of doing the things that we don't want to do for the sake of doing them and for the sake of trying to make our life better. Because my life is going to be better when I finish that gun cabinet, right? Because I can stop having my guns in the closet, and I can put them in a cabinet, have them nicely displayed and all that. But that part aside, I suppose, it's important for us to make sure that we act at the first prompting, that if we have that motivation to go do the dishes or clean our room, that we act on it. We don't say, just going to scroll for 5 more minutes. Just 5 more. And then I'll go, no, act now, because you're not going to act otherwise. I know I fall into the same trap. I want to have the habit of having a clean, orderly room, but that doesn't happen because I'd say to myself, 5 more minutes. Oh, I'm just going to do this other thing. It's not how we should act. And William James points that out. And that's why it's a maxim in his formulation of habits, how to set up habits properly. And then number four, I think, is the most important when we consider willpower, because as willpower is that force that pushes the potential into the actual, we have to have strong enough willpower to move it. Now, when we've become sedentary for so long, when we've become this immovable stone, whether or not we're depressed or whether or not we're just lazy, whether our goals aren't as ordered as they should be, it takes a lot more to move a stone that's been sitting there for a while. It's created a divot than a stone that was just recently rolled there because it hasn't had as much time to settle. And so what we need to do is, maybe this habit over here isn't quite moving as fast as we want it to. We're not quite actualizing that. We don't have the willpower to get it. How we get the willpower is then we say, okay, I am going to do something else. I'm going to do something else that requires a lot of effort, but not quite as much as this one, because for whatever reason, this one's stuck. I can't quite figure it out. And so I'm going to try this one over here. And so number 4 is keep the faculty of effort alive in you by a little gratuitous exercise every day. And that's exactly what we need to do to increase our willpower. We need to do the things we don't want to do in order to do the things that we want to do when they get hard, right? To improve our life, we have to build this habit of always doing something, right? Because when we do nothing, we're acting in opposition to our very nature, because we're meant and called to create and to build and to beautify. But if we're not acting in the ways that we don't want to, what's to say that we get to act in the way that we want to? Because who knows? Because we're not spending the time acting in how we want to or how we don't want to. And so why do we get to, who says that we're acting right? And so by doing this effort, this effortful action, it's going to increase the willpower that we are trying to build, right? If we're doing hard things because they're hard, we're going to be able to do hard things that we want to do when they get hard. And so it's very good. And so those are the 4 maxims just laid out. And when we think of all of the, because I could go into the neurology of this, right? I could talk about the synapses firing more focused. And what's interesting too in James's writing, and I think it's a shame that we aren't exposed to this when we're talking about, the history of psychology and where it's come from. James has a profound understanding of what our actual neuronal capabilities are, and he talks from a very neurological framework, but he also is able to mesh in this classical philosophy because, well, that's what he was educated in. And so we're no longer educated in that, so we don't talk about it. And I think that's a shame, because the eloquence in which James writes is so beautiful, and I just love reading it, and it's made me a little bit better writer and a better speaker. And now there's a timeliness to it, right? I can't sit here and write like James did now and expect people to find that interesting. It's a little bit too highbrow, I would suppose, for most people to find it interesting. But when we think about habits, all of this can go back to our neurology, because we're just trying to funnel the paths, the correct paths, the paths that we want, and we want to funnel our will, we want to funnel those impulses into the desirable outcome, right? And so we have to have an identity, we have to have a plan, we have to have all of these things set in order so that we act accordingly. And I think that this is really important when we when we talk about why we set habits, right? Why can't we just, as James pointed out, the sensuality, the person who just is at the whim and very weak-willed. But why do we have to have habits, especially ones where we're required to do hard things? And I think he illustrates it perfectly, and again, just as a testament to his understanding of the importance of habit. And so he says here that habit is thus the enormous flywheel of society, its most precious conservative agent. Already at the age of 25, you see the professional mannerism settling down on the young commercial traveler, on the young doctor, on the young minister, on the young counselor at law. You see the little lines of cleavage running through the character, the tricks of thought, the prejudices, the way of the shop, in a word, for which the man can by and by no more escape that than his coat sleeve can suddenly fall into a new set of folds. On the whole, it is best he should not escape. It is well for the world that in most of us, by the age of 30, the character has set like plaster and will never soften again. And so sometimes people dismiss his idea of character and his idea of the plasticity that we have. And we know that we can adjust our habits, but for the most part, much of who we are and much of who I'm going to be and who you're going to be is set by the time we've reached middle adulthood, right? Because it's not useful for us to have all of these constant fluxes. And so we've kind of set in our character. We've set in our character a bit. Our personality has kind of matured into what it's going to be. Our brain is fully developed by then. And so all of our impulses and all of our habits are going to be kind of set. And just like he said, it's no easier for us to escape that character than it is for our coat to just fall into a new set of configuration, right? It can't just magically become a handkerchief one day unless, acted upon by great force. But it can't just magically suddenly fall into it. It's set. It's there. It's comprised in that manner. And we can't change it. And so it's important for us to educate our habits, to educate the will. Because, again, no matter how full a reservoir of maxims one may possess, and no matter how good one's sentiments may be, if one have not taken advantage of every concrete opportunity to act, one's character may remain entirely unaffected for the better. And so we can have all of these plans, all of these goals. We can even set up as clear as day the principles that James Clear is talking about, right, in Atomic Habits. We can set up a plan for that. But unless we act, as Jung says, that which acts is actual, right? We have to act for things to actually happen, and we have to act for new habits to take place. And so I think it's important for us to, not only us, but those who we're involved with in society, to form new habits and to get rid of old ones and to point ourselves in the most pointed direction. This all boils down to virtue, because we fall to the level of our training, right? We fall to those systems. And what better system than one that's educated on the highest possible way to act, right? The best course of action is already something that's an education, right? And so we don't have to sit and deliberate, because when we don't have the immediate resources to act, what we do is we resort to something lower. We just go down the chain. So if our higher order brain, if our executive functioning is overwhelmed and we can't quite process it, we go to our emotional state, our more emotional brain. And then if that fails, if we still can't figure out what that is, and a lot of it's predicated on the higher order thought, right, the executive functioning, if we don't have a system of control and order set in place, we fall back to the survival brain, and that's just fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so we just start to act in whatever way is going to get us in some sort of direction, anywhere better than here kind of deal. And so when we think about virtue and how we can act better, we need to set up habits in order for us to educate ourselves, and then we need to take those habits and try to elevate ourselves to the point that our baseline system is virtue, that it's right and just action. And we could go into what the virtues are, but I'm not going to, just for the sake of time. But I think it's important that if we're going to live truly independent and virtuous and in a way that we want, we have to have habits that are set to the highest possible degree of our character, of who we are, of what we can accomplish. And if we don't, we're doing ourselves an injustice, and we're going to set ourselves up for failure and a life of failure and a life of misery. And we're going to be like that man that is lighting every cigar just on a whim. And maybe it's not even a whim. Maybe it's a half an hour debate on whether or not he should light the cigar. Well, if you have a plan for when you smoke your cigars, or you have a plan of when you drink water, how many times you drink water, it's just going to be a no-brainer. You don't even have to worry about it. How good of a life is that? And then you can focus on your side gig. You can focus on being the best employee that you can be, or the best boss, the best employer. You can focus on those things. And because habit is the enormous flywheel, it brings us all into a synchronicity of sorts, right? And so when we don't have a habit, when we aren't predictable, it throws everything out of whack. It loses trust in society when it gets big enough. And so I think that it's important to go through a few more quotes here, just to provide some motivation, right? To provide maybe that emotional prompting that's necessary. Because what James gives us is not just a means to form great habits. He gives us this means to strengthen the thing that's predicated on carrying out those habits. It gives us the means to strengthen the will. And that's the important part of all of this. So regarding the fourth maxim, that is, be systematically ascetic or heroic in little unnecessary points. Do every day or two something for no other reason that you would rather not do it, so that when the hour of dire need draws nigh, it may find you not unnerved and untrained to stand the test. Asceticism of this sort is like the insurance which a man pays on his house and goods. The tax does him no good at the time, and possibly may never bring him a return. But if the fire does come, his having paid it will be his salvation from ruin. So with the man who has daily injured himself to habits of concentrated attention, energetic volition, and self-denial in unnecessary things. He will stand like a tower when everything rocks around him, and when his softer fellow mortals are winnowed like chaff in the blast. Wow. Wouldn't that be something? To be like a tower, standing unshaken, right? As opposed to wheat, a stalk of grass in the wind, right? I know which one I'd rather be. And so I think it's important that we continue to do things because they are not necessary. And in that last step fortifies the first three. And so all of those are predicated on willpower, the will to actually take what we are confronting and put our plan into action, right? To confront the thing with a plan, to have an ordered set of ways that we are trying to manage the problem, how to conduct ourselves in that. It's all predicated on these other things that we're doing on the side, these things that we don't want to do. And we're doing them just because, and that's what we need to do if we want to get better. Now, you don't have to. You don't have to do that. And you also might be thinking to yourself, well, my education didn't set me up for this. I didn't have the education of William James. No, me personally, I didn't have the education of William James. I wasn't a Harvard professor. I didn't start the American psychological movement. I didn't do that. And so how might I ever achieve this? How might I ever reach to this capacity? I'm doomed. James has another word of encouragement for you. Let no youth have anxiety about the upshot of his education, whatever the line of it may be. If he keep faithfully busy each hour of the waking day, he may safely leave the final result to itself. He can with perfect certainty count on waking up some fine morning to find himself one of the competent ones of his generation in whatever pursuit he may have singled out. Silently, between all the details of his business, the power of judging in all that class of matter will have built itself up with him as a possession that will never pass away. Young people should know this truth in advance. The importance of it has probably engendered more discouragement and faint-heartedness in youth embarking on arduous careers than all other causes put together. And I think he's right. I think he's absolutely right in that I certainly wasn't told this. I wasn't certainly told that if you set up your habits now, you won't have to do it again. And it'll be much easier to continue those habits later. And you're going to reap the benefits of not having to relearn them than if you just ignore it, right? When we think of compound interest, and Einstein said that the eighth wonder of the world is compound interest. And so we need to understand that the sooner we do this, the sooner we start, the better we are, right? That could be in a month, that could be in a year, that could be in 10 years. If you're young, if you're like me, I'm only 24. If you start now, by the time you're 30, you're going to have a much better life than if you don't start to put your habits in order. And so I encourage you to start today, to start building habits, because there's no way that you can be heroic without education and without the education, more importantly, of the will, right? So you have to understand that you are will and intellect and feeling and sensation, these things you aren't taught necessarily, right? Things you might be able to construe together, but you weren't taught that, and that's okay. But let's move forward. Let's continue to grow together and continue to flourish as a society, because right now I don't think we're doing that. We're very lackadaisical at best. And so let us continue to do hard things. Let us continue to have plans. Let us continue to want to reach for more, want to grow, not only for us, but for our future generations, right? We should be starting today, this hour, this very minute. You should be starting and trying to work towards a better plan, a better goal, a better vision, and a better action. And above all, act. Do the things. I don't care if it takes you 20 hours to figure out that what you were doing wasn't the right thing, because guess what? You were doing something for 20 hours. That's better than scrolling on your phone and just laying in this ambiguity of the internet, of this society that we are trying so desperately to cling to, but fail because we don't have the capacity. We haven't properly set ourselves up straight in order to actually bring about the change that we want. It's much easier to sit and cry on social media about this thing or that thing than to do something about it. And so let's start to change our lives and then worry about changing whatever it is we're crying about, because we're only making ourselves feel better when we're crying about, this politician or that social issue or whatever. If your life isn't set up in an orderly fashion, if you're not taking care to bring about a new habit and a new order pointed towards the highest good you could imagine, then you're doing it wrong. And there's no reason that I should believe that you have my best interest in mind. And that's what it comes down to, right? I don't go on this ramble for nothing. I sincerely mean it, that I can't tell you about your own life until I set my habits in order. And so before recording this episode, I had to go clean the dishes up. I had to. And I had to start some laundry. And I had to clean up my room a bit because I'd put it off, and I couldn't bring myself to record this episode and to be a hypocrite. And so maybe that's the first thing that we start to confront and to admit to ourselves what we aren't doing, and then figuring out if we should do it, and if we should, setting up habits to make us more efficient so that we can continue to receive the compounding interest of the freedom of our mind and unburdened from the shackles of time by making our lives more efficient. And so I hope that was helpful. I didn't quite take a turn that I expected, but that's okay. Because I think that it's really important things to discuss when we talk about the cultural relevance, when we talk about what actual bearing this has on our lives. And so if you liked what I had to say, if you followed along for the whole time, make sure you hit the subscribe button and like to let me know that you reached the end of the video. It was great to have you along, and I'm going to see you next time.